Hello, everybody. I am Joe Harper, and this is Reformed Truther Ministries. And the title of this video is Interacting with Falling Flat Part 2. So, some of you may have watched my Part 1 where I interacted with the book Falling Flat by Danny Faulkner. And I have a copy of that book right here. So, I've decided to, on the request of some people who are supportive of this, I've decided to turn this into a series, and I've decided to expand upon the work that I did in part one. And that's what I said even in that video, which was what I was likely going to do. And if you remember, in part one, just to summarize what we went through, I talked about why I believe Faulkner is generally not a reliable source on this topic, which offended some people. I did say that I believe he uses straw man. I believe he uses sophistry, which is fallacious intellectual arguments that are at their base are deceptive. And I said overall he's just unreliable, which infuriated some people in the comments. We're going to expand upon that today. Like I said last time, we covered the front cover, the back cover. We talked about the introduction to the book. We got into some of the material from chapter 1. And then I went forward to chapters 10 and 11. And we were really talking about really his approach to the book. And when we got into some of the historical quotations, we really interacted specifically with how Faulkner misrepresented Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and Martin Luther. So we talked about church history a lot last week. Now, for this one today, as I'm going to turn this into a series, I've decided, because of all the criticisms you get when you talk about the flat earth subject, and people really just don't want to concede any ground on anything, I've decided it's really important to just take this really slow, go through this really thoroughly. So the plan is I'm going to not rush through this, but we're going to go through the historical arguments until I feel like we've made an adequate case for this. So we're going to do history again today. And there may even be, I need to kind of look at my material, but I may even do a part 3 on more of the medieval sources and get into more maps. But once we've established our footing with the history, we'll move into the biblical arguments, and then, Lord willing, we will conclude with the empirical scientific stuff. But really today it's going to be about history, and really my goal for today is we're going to be talking about Babylonian cosmology, Egyptian cosmology, Hebrew cosmology, and Greek cosmology. So we're really just trying to establish, for Christians, the most important one of these is the Hebrews, the people who the biblical writers, that was their culture, that was their belief system. The people who wrote the Old and New Testaments, if the worldview of that group was a flat earth viewpoint, and there's nothing in the scriptures that contradict that, well, that's a very important historical argument for the flat earthers. And that's really what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be using quotations to try to document that. And I want to start here with just a brief review of the belief of those who hold to biblical cosmology or flat earth. In this logo here, or this graphic, this comes from Logos Bible Software, where Dr. Michael Heiser was, during his life, a scholar in residence with that institution. And this, and we'll get into a little bit later how Dr. Michael Heiser, even though he pushed back very strongly against flat earth and even called the belief stupid, he also, in his scholarship, also very vigorously defended the idea that the Hebrews of biblical times believed in a flat earth. And this is a conception of, this is what it says, ancient Hebrew conception of the universe. And people from Logos they got angry at Rob Skiba, because Rob Skiba would often use this picture in his lectures to defend flat earth. And at one point they said, will you please stop doing that? And he said, well, why would I not use this graphic if you agree this is what the ancient Hebrews believe? And he talks about that in his videos. So you can go back and watch some of those Rob Skiba videos and hear how he irritated Logos Bible Software. But as you see here, I just want to start by reviewing this model, because this is going to give us so much context for the history today. And you see, you have the surface of the earth, and you have a flat and stationary circular plane. You have Sheol below and the great deep below. and then you have a solid firmament encasing this round circular plane above. And then you have the waters above, and then above that would be the third heaven, as Paul calls it, or the heaven of heavens, as it says here. And that's where the throne room of God is. That's where we believe Jesus is right now, waiting to return to the earth. So heaven is up and hell is down. It's actually a very simple model. Some people have said that's a very simplistic medieval way to view the world. And what we're saying is the Bible actually makes it very clear. Heaven is up and hell is down. But we'll get into that more as we move along. But this is really important for us to understand and have a foundation for moving forward. That being said, the other thing I want to do before we get into all of this argumentation today, I just want to go through this systematically. And I'm going to do the Babylonians and the Egyptian view. And then we'll go to the Hebrew view, which we're already starting to show here. And then we're going to also talk about the Greek view as well. But that being said, I just want to turn to Genesis chapter 1. And I'm going to read verses 6 and 7 here. And these verses defend, even though the skeptics would disagree with this, but these verses defend the idea of a solid firmament. And what we need to understand is we are saying that the earth is encased by a firmament that is solid. And the Hebrew word is rakia, which is based from the root Hebrew word of raka. And then the Greeks in the Septuagint, they translate this as stereoma, which that word also means something solid. And in Jerome, in his Latin Vulgate, used the word firmamentum, which is another word, once again, referring to something solid. So solid, solid, solid. And let me read this, and I'll commentate on this further. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And then verse 8, and God called the firmament heaven, and the second and the morning were the second day. So this idea that there is a solid barrier that separates the waters above from the waters below. And most modern Bible exegetes or theologians today, they'll say that the firmament is referring to the expanse of the air. They don't think it is referring to something solid. And in other videos I've done, I've talked about how if you go to Job chapter 37 or other places where it talks about how the root word raka is referring to something that is stamped out. And if you want to hear me talk about that and the entire creation week in more detail, if you go onto this channel and you go to my Foundations in Faith RTM radio number 2, I go through the entire creation week there, and I just lay this out biblically. And if you want to hear that, that one is not as polemical as this video, but I lay all that out. But that is what we believe. That is what the flat earthers believe. And when we get into the biblical portions of this series, we're going to get into that more. But we just need to have that foundation. And we're saying that this is what the ancient Hebrews believed as well. So that's really where we're going to start today. And that being said, the next thing I'm going to quote here to document this, I'm going to give 2 sources to document this. And then from there, we're going to go to reading Danny Faulkner. Because what we're going to see here is that Danny Faulkner does not believe that the ancient Hebrews believed in flat earth cosmology. He rejects this. He's saying Faulkner's argument is that really nobody of substance, with a few notable exceptions, believed in flat earth throughout history, because he says, the belief of the flat earthers is that this view was held by people throughout history until the 15th and the 16th centuries, around the time of Copernicus. And then this deception has increased for the past 500 years. And I would say that's generally true. We're going to see that the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and Socrates and Pythagoras held this view, but that their views were not extensively held by everybody in the world just because those individuals did. But Faulkner's argument in his book is really that this is a modern movement that has come about because of fallacious understandings of history. And then obviously he believes we're misinterpreting scripture. And he really is unafraid to say that the movement is quite stupid. But if we can document that no, ancient peoples did believe in this, just as we talked about last time, how there are prominent figures from church history who believes in this. Well, then when we move forward to the biblical arguments and the empirical arguments, we're going to be in a lot better shape to start to establish a foothold for good argument, a foundation for good argumentation. So I'm going to quote from an individual named Paul H. Seeley, who was an individual who did not believe in flat earth, but did academically argue that the ancient Hebrews did believe in a flat earth. And he was saying this was the ancient belief that was predominant amongst various peoples of the world. And maybe even before I have two pictures here showing the beliefs of the Babylonians and Egyptians. So let me show those graphics before I move forward to Seeley. But here is a Babylonian tablet that is believed to be one of the first world maps in history. And if you type in Babylonian world map into Google, this is the image that you're going to get. And it shows a flat circular disc, and this is supposed to represent the whole world. And the Babylonians believed in the dome being solid or dome-like, just like the Hebrews did, is also a part of their cosmological view. So I'm just going to leave this up here for another second so people can look at this. But this is called the Babylonian world map or the Babylonian tablet. So that's one illustration that we have here of what the ancient peoples believed regarding cosmology. And this lines up with what we've seen with the Hebrews. And then if I go to this one on the Egyptians, and this one here, this is depicting, it's obviously, this is a religious hieroglyph, and we're going to see here that their god or goddess Noon is associated with their belief in a solid firmament, but the Egyptians believed in that the sky was a solid dome covering. So just like how we see the Babylonian graphic, go back to that one for a sec, of this world disk, flat world disk, this graphic here is showing, it's a depiction of the sky, and you see the stars there, and it's a dome covering the earth. And it's obviously in their mythology and their religious depictions of things, they are associating this with gods and goddesses. And that's typical of what you see with the cosmologies of ancient peoples. It gets mixed in with their religions and their mythologies. So we need to take these things with a certain grain of salt, but we really just want to establish that this was a belief amongst the ancient peoples of the world. And then as we move forward in history, we can go from there. Now, I'm going to go to Paul H. Seeley, who wrote this work called The Firmament and the Waters Above. And this was published in the Westminster Theological Journal. So Westminster Theological Seminary, they have a journal called the Westminster Theological Journal, and they posted this article in their journal. So they said, this is somebody who has academic respectability. His views, he said, he disagreed with the flat earth view. He said this is the belief of primitive ancient peoples, but he had enough academic integrity and scholarship to say that this is what the peoples of biblical times believed. And that's important. And because this was published in their journal in 1991, before, flat earth took off on YouTube and the internet and whatever, they probably didn't know that this would be such a controversy now, as it is now. But this is in the providence of God. This is what happened. So I'm pulling this up. And on the divinecouncil.com, once again, related to Dr. Michael Heiser, because Heiser also defended this view that the ancient Hebrews believed this. They actually have this article available to read. I'm going to share the link to this article and an article from Dr. Michael Heiser in the links below for this video. So give me a sec here as I'm going to this. I'm just going to read a few quotations from this. Okay, the ancient Eastern view of the sky. This is what we want. So he makes reference here to the Egyptian pyramid texts of 2000 BC, and you can look these up on Google, seem to speak of the sky as being made of metal. Max Mueller accepted this idea and went on to say that the Egyptians apparently believed the firmament was made specifically of iron. He says the conception of a metal dome explains some expressions of later times, such as the name of iron, benepet, or sky metal, or the later word thunder, crew by, literally sound of metal. Thunder was evidently explained as the beating of giant sheets of metal which constituted the sky. And then he says, whatever the case may be, as to exactly what material the ancient Egyptians thought the sky was made of, they certainly believed that it was solid. And then he goes on to give quotations from these pyramid texts that you can look those up online. But that is a source reference that would prove that the Egyptians believed in this. And then here's another excerpt from this same article. And I'm going to post this whole article so you can read this in context. This isn't getting cherry picked. But then he says, in Babylonian thought, the solidity of the firmament is most clearly seen in tablet 4 of Enuma Elish, particularly in lines 137 through 38, where Marduk, having killed Tiamat, quote, split her in half like a shellfish, and from one half made and covered the heavens, unquote. Or, as Heidel translated the passage, which half of Tiamat, Marduk, formed the sky as a roof, unquote. The solidity of the sky is also seen in tablet 5, 9 through 11, where Marduk, quote, opened the gates on both sides, unquote, so that the sun could pass through the morning and the evening. And then in her belly he placed the zenith, unquote. So he's using these tablets to establish the same belief, and he believes that this is scientifically naive, but he's saying that the Egyptians, if you look at their historical records, believed in a solid sky, and he's saying the same thing for the Babylonians. And we've given two images that are good historical proofs. We have the hieroglyph from Egypt, and we have the Babylonian world map, this tablet. All of this evidence shows that the ancient Babylonians and the ancient Egyptians believed in a flat earth cosmology with a solid dome covering above it. Now, you may say at this point, oh, they were scientifically naive, whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's irrelevant for what we believe today, but we need to start chronologically at the beginning and start to systematically move forward in order to get anywhere in this conversation. Then I'm going to quote Seeley here on the Hebrews. So this is what he says. To believe that the Hebrews were any less scientifically naive than their neighbors, since from a cultural standpoint, the Hebrews' pre-Solomonic architecture and pottery were, quote, vastly inferior, unquote, to that of their neighbors, one might gather that the early Hebrews were possibly more scientifically naive than their neighbors, but certainly similarly, the fact that it was not the Hebrews but their neighbors who led the technological advance from the use of bronze to the use of iron. And then he gives quotations from Joshua 17:18 and Judges 1:19. He says, suggests, if anything, that the Hebrews were more scientifically naive than their neighbors. It certainly does not suggest that they were less so, nor do we have any evidence from biblical times that suggests that the Hebrews were ever more scientifically sophisticated than their neighbors. Accordingly, it seems most probable that so far as the physical nature of the sky is concerned, the Hebrews, as a typical scientifically naive people, believed that the rakia, or the firmament, was solid. And he goes into a lot more detail getting into all this. And then he's scrolling down here where he talks about the rabbinic Jewish literature and the early Christians. He says, Jews speculated as to what material the firmament was made of. Clay or copper or iron. They differentiated between the firmament and the empty space or air between it and the earth. They tried to figure out how thick it was by employing biblical interpretation. Most tellingly, they even tried to calculate scientifically the thickness of the firmament. Excuse me. Christians speculated as to whether it was made of earth, air, fire, or water, the basic elements of Greek science. And he says, Origen called the firmament without doubt firm and solid, unquote. First homily on Genesis. Ambrose, commenting on Genesis 1:6, said, unquote, the specific solidity of this exterior firmament is meant. Hexameron, FC 4260. Augustine said that the word firmament was used to, quote, to indicate not that it was motionless, but that it was solid and that it constitutes an impassable boundary between the waters above and the waters below, the literal meaning of Genesis. I'm going to stop there. So we talked about Augustine last week. I think we quoted from Augustine's literal meaning of Genesis. And yeah, so he's saying that Ambrose and Origen would held the same thing. And he's saying that the later Jewish rabbinic literature would agree with this idea of a solid firmament. And he's saying that the ancient Hebrews, this would go back to, they would believe in this as well as the Babylonians and the Egyptians. So people could say, I mean, he gives a lot of good historical reference to specific tablets, specific documentation to say there are good reasons to believe that the ancient peoples believed in the sky. And the idea to say, if we, as the flat earth community, if we say, hey, maybe they weren't wrong, it's so insulting to the modern notion that we are so much more advanced in our knowledge and wisdom than they are. Now, obviously, they got things wrong back then, too. They lived in a much earlier date in history. But to say, hey, maybe they were onto something, even if obviously some of these details about how these cultures are describing things isn't perfectly accurate, but to say in general, hey, maybe there is really a dome above the sky, that's something that is so insulting to the modern mind. It's something that a lot of them can't really handle. Now, that being said, I'm going to go next to Dr. Michael Heiser. And he has an article here on Flat Earth, too. You guys are going to have to, here we go. I know this is a lot of reading in this episode. It's a massive information dump, but it's just so important for us to for me with this specific subject matter to document everything I say, because otherwise, unfortunately, you just get picked apart. But in this article, once again, I don't want to misrepresent Heiser. The title of the article is Christians Who Believe the Earth is Really Flat. Does it get any dumber than this? So he's pushing back against this very hard. But what we're going to see here, and the reason why I'm quoting it at all, he's saying, yeah, the Hebrews believed it, but they're wrong. This is the same kind of, I really appreciate a lot of what Heiser wrote on things related to the divine council or the Nephilim or whatever. He did make some really good contributions, but he had his blind spots. I think also the same way he took a local flood view. And so there are times where, for me, I've said I really appreciate certain things Heiser wrote, but sometimes you really got to spit them out. But yeah, he is really valuable in regards to this concept that the ancient Hebrews believed in a flat earth. So I'm going to read an excerpt from this article. And like I said, I'm going to post this whole article, even though it's pushing back against my view, because we want to be honest, we want to be fair. But what Heiser says here is that the ancient peoples of the world believed, he's saying that they believed that the Hebrews believed that the world was flat. Okay, so here's what Heiser says. My position is straightforward. The biblical writers do indeed describe a flat, round earth with other flat earthers, with other features that the flat earthers skip. See below. They wrote about the world this way because they lived at a time before knowledge of the natural world was sufficient to demonstrate otherwise. But I don't believe the earth is really flat, quote, because the Bible tells me so, unquote. The knowledge of the biblical writers had their physical surroundings isn't a truth proposition for biblical theology. Anyone who uses my work to prop up this idea without providing a disclaimer that I reject modern flat earth thinking is unprincipled and deliberately dishonest. That's fair. I would say that's fair. So, hey, I gave the disclaimer. Go read everything he wrote on it. But yeah, let's keep going. I can already hear the comeback, quote, let God be true and every man be a liar, unquote. Yeah, I agree with that too. That's fair too. hey, Heiser, you're wrong because you admitted the Bible says it. You said the Bible's wrong and the Bible is right and you're wrong. And this is the heart of the argument right here. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the whole debate over cosmology if you're an evangelical Christian. And this is the same type of stuff that Faulkner says. This is it. If you want to sum it up, they'll say the verses appear to say that, and then they'll try to explain them away, and they'll say, oh, you're using bad hermeneutics or you're reading it literalistically. But all of them more or less say, yeah, it does appear to say that, or the ancient peoples believe that, but then they'll, in various ways, through various means of argumentation, say it's just wrong anyway. And that's the point. It's not. But let me continue with Heiser. But that is the whole debate in a nutshell right there. So let me backtrack here. I can already hear the comeback, quote, let God be true and every man a liar, unquote. Let me just say God isn't a liar. He knows and knew the earth is a globe. Don't agree with that. It happens that the people he chose to produce this thing we call the Bible didn't know that, and God couldn't have cared less. The writers God used to produce the Bible were not inspired to write about things of the natural world that were beyond their own worldview and knowledge base, and to argue as normal 24-hour day creationists do that God gave them advanced scientific knowledge, or that such advanced knowledge is encrypted in the biblical text means that they wrote could never have communicated that important knowledge to their original audience or any audience prior to recent centuries. These approaches are absurd and undermine the communicative purpose of the Bible. We read in Genesis and elsewhere. What we read in Genesis and elsewhere reflects a common ancient Near Eastern perspective about cosmology, with one crucial difference. The credit for creation is given exclusively to the God of Israel against all other gods. That is its truth claim with respect to creation. The Israelite cosmology is quite consistent with wider Near Eastern cosmology, is easy to demonstrate. That God chose people of a certain time, a certain place, and asserted limited knowledge base up to him. We dishonor his choices when we impose our questions and our context on the biblical writers. And I'm going to stop there. But once again, you can go read this in its whole context. But you see what he's saying. He's saying the ancient Israelites did believe in this. He's saying that it's the same as what the Babylonians or the Egyptians, the wider Near East, believed. He's saying historically it's easy to demonstrate. We've demonstrated that. And he's saying they had limited knowledge and they were wrong. And it wasn't God's intention to show that advanced scientific knowledge of creation. So you can see with Heiser, I mean, this is why I'm not afraid to quote him. And I want to give it in the proper context. But I would say Heiser has more academic integrity than Faulkner, even though they hold the same position that this is wrong. Heiser is able to say, yes, they did believe that. And that's what Paul H. Seeley said. He says, yes, they did believe that. And that's really the context for that. And then it leads to the question, do you believe the people who wrote the Bible describe creation accurately or not? And we're going to get into that when we get to the biblical text. And as Protestants, it ultimately is going to come down to let God be true and every man be a liar. It's going to come down eventually to, does the text say that or not? But before we get to that, we're setting the context of that with the history here first. Now we're going to go to Faulkner. So I'm going to quote here from Faulkner on page 302 and page 303 of his book. And what we're going to see here is that he's going to deny that the Hebrews believe this. And he won't even concede what Heiser and Seeley did. And he says, so I've given you the context. He's saying the Hebrews did not believe that. That's historically inaccurate. And he says, flat earthers sometimes appeal to the book of Enoch and Josephus as expositions of what the ancient Hebrews thought about cosmology. I discussed the pseudo-pigraphic book of Enoch in the next chapter. While cosmology does not seem to be the purpose of the book of Enoch, as I point out in the next chapter, it does seem to endorse something like the flat earth cosmology of today, but with some important differences. It isn't known about how popular the cosmology of the Book of Enoch was among Jews 2,000 years ago. As for Josephus, he wrote very little about cosmology. According to William Winston's 1737 translation in Book 1, Chapter 1 of the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus wrote the following about days 2, 3, and 4 of the creation week. So here now Faulkner's quoting Josephus. After this, on the second day, he placed the heaven over the whole world, and he separated it from the other parts, and he determined that it should stand by itself. He placed a crystalline firmament round it, and put it together in a manner agreeable to the earth, and fitted it for giving moisture and rain, and affording the advantage of dews. On the third day, he appointed dry land to appear, with the sea itself round about it. And on the very same day, he made the plants and the seeds spring out of the earth. And on the fourth day, he adorned the heaven with the sun, the moon, and the other stars, and appointed them their motions and courses, that the vicissitude of the seasons may be clearly signified. And then going back to Faulkner, he says, this is sparse. However, notice that Josephus seems to separate, quote, the heavens over the whole world, unquote, and, quote, and the, quote, crystalline firmament round it, unquote. This deviates from what day 2 account reveals. For Genesis 1:6 makes it very clear that God made the rakia and equated it with heaven. That is, at least in the day 2 account, the rakia and heaven are the same thing. Therefore, Josephus's separation of the two is unwarranted. Flat earthers like to mingle the two, particularly Josephus's statement that the crystalline firmament and heaven were put, quote, together in a manner agreeable to the earth, and fitted it for giving moisture and rain, and for affording the advantage of dews. Flat earthers want to merge this function into one entity, with the waters above being part of the rain cycle, particularly at the time of the flood. But this isn't necessarily what Josephus said. However, most important is that Josephus wrote that God placed the crystalline firmament round the earth, not above the earth. This terminology doesn't make sense if the earth is flat with the dome over it. However, this makes sense in terms of the dominant Greek cosmology of his day, a spherical earth surrounded by a firm celestial sphere or spheres on which the astronomical bodies were affixed. Whew, that's a lot of reading. So we're going to break all this down. There's a lot here. First, talk about the Josephus quote himself. And like Faulkner said, it comes from this book here. Well, this is the complete works of Josephus, translated by William Winston. That's who he made mention of. And the specific work of Josephus is the Antiquities of the Jews. And Josephus is a really important scholar for history in general and for biblical scholarship. If you train at the seminary level in most evangelical seminaries, at some point in one of the classes you're going to take, they're going to say that Josephus is a very important extra biblical work that gives a lot of context to history and specifically to biblical history. His account of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by the Romans is usually the part that he's quoted from most extensively when he goes into detail describing that. It's also interesting that his works describe Jesus of Nazareth, and he really isn't completely hostile to the claim that Jesus is the Messiah, actually, even though I don't think Josephus ever converted. But there's a lot about his histories that is really interesting and really important. And I'm saying all this because he's an important work. Now, the reason why it's relevant for our purposes, because Josephus wrote in the 1st century, if his quotation does support a solid firmament and he's a 1st century historian, well, this is that's a big historical check for those who say that, yes, peoples in the ancient past believed in this idea of a solid firmament. So let me just read this again, the Josephus quote. I'm just going to read a part of it here. But this is what Josephus said. He said, he also placed a crystalline firmament round it and put together in a manner agreeable to the earth. And then Faulkner, what he did was he really tried to break this apart. And what we're going to see here, I think this is an example of where Faulkner is using that sophistry, fallacious argumentation that is deceptive. That's the definition of sophistry in regards to this quote. And what he's doing is he's taking a very clear, straightforward reading of this quotation that supports the solid firmament, and he's trying to explain it away. Another terminology I could use that's a little bit more slang is word salad. He takes something that's clear and straightforward and he explains it away and makes it muddled and confusing. And what he's saying is that the solid firmament is, he believes the ancient Greeks believed in this globe of the heavens, and then there's the other heavenly bodies around it, and there's some type of a solid barrier surrounding even all of that. And that's really what he's claiming is the views of guys like Ptolemy. I think Ptolemy may believe that, but he's saying that's basically what all Greeks believed, and that's what that's the context for Josephus's quotation here, because he was a Hellenized or Greek Jew. And there are three lines of argumentation that Faulkner uses to try to support his claim. He says that Josephus makes this distinction between heaven and the firmament. He talks about that. He talks about how flat earthers are often confused on making proper distinctions on this point. But the biggest point that Faulkner emphasizes is that Josephus uses the crystalline firmament around the earth. And he says it's impossible for that to be referring to a solid dome covering over the earth. And he's claiming instead that it's talking about something surrounding the heavenly bodies, which is really breaks apart this entire quotation and makes it really confusing. But when you read this quote in its context, Josephus, he talks about the dry land and the waters surrounding the dry land, and then the firmament, you could say this word round, above or around or encompassing the earth. I think the quotation really does speak for itself. I just feel like he's trying to explain it away. And that once again, that's sophistry, that's word salad, that's whatever term you want to use. He's taking something that's clear and straightforward, and he's trying to make it confusing. And we're going to get to the Greeks a little bit later in the video. But this is what Josephus says. He placed the crystalline firmament round it and put it together in a manner agreeable to the earth, and fitted it for giving moisture and rain and affording the advantage of the dews. Now listen to this part. On the third day, he appointed the dry land to appear with the sea itself around it. And on the very same day, he made plants and seeds to spring out of the earth. And then on the fourth day, he adorned the heaven with the sun, the moon, and the stars, and appointed them for their motions and courses. This is very similar to the description of the earth that when I read from Martin Luther's commentary, and we saw this exact same type of thing, that the dry land is the center. Luther talked about how the seas are the walls or the edges, and then the heavens are the earth. Now, this is an English translation. I'm not going to claim that I know how to read Josephus in the original languages. I think William Winston's translation is accurate, and I think that's generally agreed by scholars. But the point is, you could use the word round to talk about a dome encompassing a flat surface. The word round wouldn't be completely out of bounds describing that. And when you read it in its context, that's what it has to say. And then Faulkner's trying to say, oh, it's impossible for it to mean that. And I don't think that's what the quote in context is really saying. Now, I just think that and he has to explain this away. Why? Because that would give historical support that the ancient Hebrews believed in this. And then he does the same thing next with the book of Enoch. So that's where I'm going to go to next, is how Faulkner, I'm going to read a couple sections from his paragraph. I'm sorry. A couple of sections from his chapter on the book of Enoch, which is chapter 12 of his book. Page 345 and then 350. So he goes through a lot of sections here on the book of Enoch. So he says, consider Enoch chapter 35, verse 1. And then this quotation from the book of Enoch reads, and from there I went towards the west and toward the ends of the earth, and I saw on the east 3 open gates, and as many gates and as many outlets. That's the Book of Enoch quotation. And going back to Faulkner, it says, apparently in the cosmology of the Book of Enoch, one can reach the Earth's edge by traveling eastward or westward. However, this is very different from the cosmology of the modern flat Earth movement. In the modern flat Earth cosmology, one can travel indefinitely eastward or westward without ever reaching the edge. Instead, one simply goes around the world. At least this is the stock answer flat earthers give to those who don't believe the earth is flat. Haven't studied the modern flat earth model much and how it is possible to circumnavigate the flat earth. Once again, the cosmology of the Book of Enoch doesn't conform to the cosmology of the modern flat earth movement. So he reads the quotation, which seems to support it, and then he says, he makes this distinction because the text reads, the Book of Enoch text says, well, if you go east or west long enough, you could circumnavigate. And, this is kind of interesting because flat earthers in terms of biblical verses are often accused of literalism. And I feel like he's making this distinction here because, yes, many flat earthers believe that the North Pole is the geographic center of the world and then also the magnetic center of the world, and that if the north is the center, a compass is always facing north. Yeah, and if you go east or west, what he said there about circumnavigation isn't completely accurate, but he's trying to say the result of that distinction he made is that therefore flat earthers can't appeal to the Book of Enoch to support their views. He's taking the text, an ancient historical narrative that's found in the Book of Enoch that you may believe is true or you may believe it's fictitious or mythological, but that's what that text is saying. And you're taking it in a way to make it say something where flat earthers are just saying this text is something that supports our view generally. And because of how modern flat earthers interpret circumnavigation, therefore you can't appeal to that. That makes no sense. That's fallacious argumentation. That's deceptive. That's sophistry. That's word salad. It is. There's no getting around that. And then he does the same thing here on page 350. It's very, very confusing. And then look at how he this part really got me. This part got me too. He says flat earthers have a peculiar relationship with the Book of Enoch. Non-Christian flat earthers view the Bible and the Book of Enoch as having equal authority. Well, okay. Christian promoters of flat earth must do careful choreography to accept the Book of Enoch to the extent of using it to interpret scripture while simultaneously giving lip service to the fact that the Book of Enoch falls short of biblical authority. And then he continues and he says, some passages of the Book of Enoch that supposedly teach that the earth is flat are ambiguous. However, a few passages do appear to indicate that the writers of the Book of Enoch believe that the earth is flat. However, other cosmological details of the Book of Enoch clearly contradict the preferred cosmology of modern flat earth proponents. This selective reading of the Book of Enoch is misleading at best. All right, first of all, I think flat earthers, generally speaking, there are disagreements about the details. A lot of us would say there's not even a perfect model of the whole thing. But to say that for flat earthers to appeal to the Book of Enoch as a historical source that supports some view, he's trying to explain that away, and that he's making these distinctions that aren't helpful and have no real bearing on the argumentation at all. That's just ridiculous. And then the part where he says Christian promoters of flat earth must do careful choreography to accept the Book of Enoch to the extent of using it to interpret scripture while simultaneously giving lip service to the fact that the Book of Enoch falls short of biblical authority. At another point in the chapter, he does concede that the Book of Enoch is probably quoted in scripture, but then he minimizes it by saying, well, there's other stuff that the Bible quotes. Listen to most evangelical expository sermons. Do preachers quote things to varying degrees of helpfulness in their sermons to illustrate points? Yes, they do. Do they usually make a good preacher will make distinctions? He may say, this quote from this theologian or this historian or whatever, is it helpful here? But I make distinctions yeah, they do that all the time. People do that. You got to take it in context. But he's trying to say that, well, for flat earthers to appeal to the Book of Enoch is really kind of, they have to do this careful choreography to accept it to some extent, but to not take it as biblical authority. That's just, once again, that's word salad. It's kind of ridiculous. Yeah, I got too many books here, but I have my copy of the Book of Enoch here. I want to read one more portion from it just to support the idea that, yes, just like I believe Josephus is a text that we can appeal to and support, the same can be true for the Book of Enoch. And I'm going to read from the Book of Enoch, chapter 18. Verses 1 through 5, just to make sure we get the point here. And he's already essentially conceded this, but then he's trying to use his methodology to try to explain away this relevance, to say, well, that doesn't really help you guys. And I'm going, well, yeah, it does. But anyway, this is First Enoch chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, and then we're going to proceed to the views of the Greeks. I saw the treasuries of all the winds. I saw how he had furnished them, the whole creation, and the firm foundations of the earth. I saw the cornerstone of the earth. I saw the four winds which bear the earth and the firmament of heaven. And I saw how the winds stretch out the vaults of heaven and have their station between heaven and earth. These are the pillars of the heaven. I saw the winds of heaven which turn and bring the circumference of the sun and all the stars to their setting. I saw the winds on the earth carrying the clouds. I saw the paths of the angels. So what do we see here? He's talking about how it talks about the firm foundations of the earth. He talks about the cornerstone of the earth. He talks about the firmament of heaven, the vaults of heaven. And then right here too, I saw the end of the earth, the firmament, and the heaven above, and I proceeded and saw a place which burns a day and night, where there are 7 mountains of magnificent stones, 3 toward the east and 3 towards the south. And as for those toward the east were colored stones, and one of pearl, one of jacinth, and one towards the south. And in other parts of the Book of Enoch, we saw this in the chapter 33 reference. We have these mentions also to the ends of the earth. It's pretty clear what the cosmology that's laid out in the Book of Enoch is, but Faulkner's just trying to explain that away. If we have to, we could always belabor this point more, but I think we see the point. And I think these sections, you look at how he's writing this stuff, and he's really not even fairly representing some of the arguments there in support of it. At least when you read Heiser, I mean, he calls it dumb, but at least he's honest about it. I mean, at least you can read it and say, he says, yeah, the ancient peoples believed in it. And Heiser at least is willing to say, yeah, if you read some of this literature, because the Book of Enoch is Second Temple era Jewish literature. So this is literature that would support that the Hebrews, once again, of biblical times, were summarizing many centuries or millennia of belief. But generally speaking, this was their worldview and this was their belief system. And you just can't get away from that. And this is something that shows that at least Heiser, you have some scholarship, you have some integrity, but Faulkner doesn't even do that. He just uses these word salad techniques to try to explain things away, even when the texts are pretty clear about what they're actually saying. And yeah, I mean, if the way he's trying to criticize the choreography dance of how people are using the Book of Enoch, I mean, I don't think he would hold a lot of preachers to that same standard when they quote stuff and they have to make distinctions. This is helpful in this area. This is not helpful in this area. I would agree with this. I don't agree with that. But apparently the flat earthers are not allowed to do that if they quote from extra text, like, say, the Book of Enoch. We could say, yes, this is helpful. This generally gives some credence to our views. We're not condoning every specific statement of this ancient text. We're not saying that the literal jot and tittle of every verse is perfectly accurate. We're saying it's not inspired. You can make those distinctions, and he's trying to claim that we cannot make those distinctions, and that's just untrue. Now, that being said, I want to move forward to the views of the ancient Greeks. And basically what Faulkner has been saying is that the ancient Greeks do not believe in this cosmology. And in page 17 of his book, this is titled Ancient Greek Cosmology. I want to read this. And basically, what I'm going to argue is that some of these philosophers, such as Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Pythagoras, yes, they did argue for a flat earth. But others, such as Herodotus of Miletus, 550 to 490 BC, Anaximenes of Miletus, 545 BC, and then most importantly, the historian Herodotus, they argue for a flat Earth. So in contrast, so we can disprove Faulkner's view that basically he says this is the predominant view of the ancient Greeks, and what I'm saying is yes, this idea was introduced by these Greek philosophers, but it doesn't mean that every single Greek believed it, or even necessarily that it became the predominant view. Now, we can debate the extent of what these things believe, but when I quote Herodotus and I show that he did not believe that, and he's the 5th century BC, so that's about 500 years before Christ, what we're saying is, yeah, these ideas got introduced by these philosophers, but it doesn't represent what everybody in the ancient world believed, and that's important. And for me, I don't feel like I need to establish that everybody believed this. I just need to show that there have been people throughout history who have believed it, and then we can go forward to the biblical text, and we can go forward to the empirical stuff, and we've already laid our foundation. And really what I'm trying to show is that in a lot of these areas, Faulkner is just misrepresenting a lot of the evidence. So page 17, Ancient Greek Cosmology. And this will give some context to what I read with the Josephus portion too. Much of Western science and philosophy traces back to the ancient Greeks. Therefore, if we want to know the history of cosmology, such as the beliefs about the Earth's shape, we ought to start with them. The writing of many early Greek scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers do not exist today. Instead, we must rely on much later sources that reported on their teachings. However, the writings of later Greeks, such as Aristotle and Ptolemy, do exist. The Greeks borrowed heavily from the Egyptians and Babylonians, though they soon built on what they borrowed and developed their own ideas. The ancient Egyptian and Babylonian cosmologies were predominantly flat Earth. However, the details varied. So there were many cosmologies of the ancient Near East. It has become fashionable now, even in some conservative circles, that believe that the Bible, being a product of the ancient Near Eastern beliefs, reflects ancient Near Eastern cosmology. Therefore, it is reasoned that the Bible teaches that the earth is flat. I will take up this question later, but I will mention here 2 problems with this teaching. First, there was no single ancient Near Eastern cosmology. So how could the Bible reflect the ancient Near Eastern cosmology? That's ridiculous once again. Second, this belief undermines the inspiration and authority of the scriptures. So, and then this is what Faulkner says. He says, in the early 6th century BC, Anaximander thought that the earth was a disk with a thickness of 1/3 its diameter, making him a flat earther. Then he says, however, Anaximander had the sun, moon, and stars orbit around the earth each day, passing below the earth to permit rising and setting. This is in stark contrast to modern flat earth cosmology. So he's doing the same thing we saw with the Book of Enoch. He's saying, well, this guy didn't agree with the details. None of us are saying that when you quote an ancient source that it has to agree with every detail with how people are trying to work things out today. That's not the point. That's kind of the point, is that you see how he does this? He'll concede a point and then he tries to argue it away. And it's just it's not very honest. But merely appear to do so that the sun and moon perpetually remain above the flat earth. Earlier Greek cosmologies probably were flat earth, but we have no knowledge of them. Later in the 6th century BC, Pythagoras proposed that there were 8 concentric spheres surrounding the earth. And then he goes on to say that, I'm not going to read all of this, but he goes on to say that Pythagoras's views were spherical, and then he says Aristotle's are spherical. And that's it. I don't even think he mentions Herodotus in here. So there's a lot could be said on this. A little bit of history of Greek philosophy that's important for us. Pythagoras, he's best known for the Pythagorean theorem. He establishes his school of philosophy, and his school of philosophy really, in some ways, it functioned like a secret society. And he traveled a lot of the non-Greek world, such as Egypt and even potentially Babylon. And as many people have pointed out in the history of science, he is very much a product of what was called the ancient mystery schools of the East. And these are really the precursors to the secret societies that come later in history. And the same is true for Socrates, that we know that Socrates went and studied under these mystery schools in Egypt. That's a very important. And then Plato and Aristotle, they are Plato is the student of Socrates. Aristotle is the student of Plato. So that's important for us. I'm not going to get into too much of this, but it does seem that their ideas are influenced from these mystery schools which they were trained in. That's kind of the flow of these ideas. I'm not going to go completely down conspiracy road on this video, but that is really the history. So even Faulkner admits that Hecataeus of Miletus and Anaximenes of Miletus, that they were they held to a flat earth cosmology, but he says that the later views of guys like Ptolemy and Aristotle and Pythagoras, he's saying that they are round earth. And I don't even have a problem with that. I have no dispute with that. But I also want to quote from Herodotus. And from there, I'm going to quote from a book called The Geographies of Herodotus. And then I'm going to, from there, go to a couple quotations from his histories. That's his work that he wrote. Herodotus is one of the world's most ancient, well-known historians. He's one of those early historians that comes up on the scene historically. And then his book, even though it's intended to be a history and it covers the Persian invasion of Greece and all the rest of that, it covers a lot of the geography of the world. So he really was one of the world's first geographers as well as historians. But the book I'm going to quote from, which is saying that Herodotus was really held to a flat earth cosmology, was this book here I'm going to quote from is called The Geography of Herodotus by James Talboy Wheeler. This book was written in 1854. And before I do that, I want to pull up here. This is essentially, apart from these philosophers that we've talked about, this is basically the view of these guys like Hecataeus of Miletus and Anaximenes of Miletus. This is the view that they held to. Now, Herodotus, he would agree with this, with the exception that he laughs at or ridicules the idea that all of the continents were of the same size, and the idea that the outward ocean perfectly went all around this. He thought the world was more nuanced than that. I'm going to read that quotation. But really, the flat earth cosmology of these two guys, Hecataeus of Miletus and Anaximenes of Miletus, is also the same view of Herodotus. So that's really important for us. So the Greeks of 500 BC, we can establish that they held to a flat earth cosmology. Now, like I said, these guys, these philosophers, yes, they did introduce spherical ideas. So we can say on Faulkner's point, yes, that is true. And the debate is not going to get settled by counting heads. But what we're trying to say is, hey, we can find our viewpoint with the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Hebrews. That's really important. And then the Greeks. And then from there, then we can move forward in history. But I'm going to read this quotation from the Geographies of Herodotus. And this is a book about his views. And this, here we go. This is page 5 and 6 of this book. And I think this will be helpful. As long as I'm getting to this. A lot of preface. A lot of preface and a lot of table of contents too. I'm reading this from National Archives because this is an older older books. So that's how I am getting access to this. And then I'm going to go to reinforce what I said. Then I'm going to go to the quotations of Herodotus himself. Okay. And this is what this man Wheeler says about Homer's views. In the Homeric cosmography of the earth is represented under the form of an immense disk or circular plane surrounded all sides by the river or quote ocean. The solid vault of the firmament was composed of metal and rested upon the circumference of this disk. And beneath the disk was the corresponding vault of Tartarus, while at the extremity of the ocean lay the Elysian plain. Quote, we're under a serene sky, the favorites of Zeus, exempt from the common lot of mortals enjoyed eternal felicity, unquote. Then I'm going back to Wheeler. Under the vault of the firmament rolled the sun and stars and chariots borne by clouds. Down in the vault of Tartarus were the abodes of the dead, or the caverns of Hades, and the residence of the Titans, the enemies of the gods, all alike impenetrable to the breath of the gale or the light of heaven. One great difficulty was in after times overcome by an extravagant invention. The sun appeared to rise from the eastern ocean, and performing its journey through the firmament seemed to sink in the western ways. Accordingly, it was supposed on descending in the west, he received in a vessel of gold fabricated by Hephaestus, which conveyed to him rapidly the north towards the east in time to recommence his daily journey. I'm going to read a bit more. The sea divided the terrestrial disk into two portions. The northern continent was named Europe, was afterwards named Europe. The southern was called Asia, but was subsequently divided into Asia or Libya. And Libya, in other words, is Africa. The Greeks probably considered Greece as situated near the center of this disk, but Homer has not disclosed to us whether he believed in this theory. And we're going to see here that Homer makes some distinctions from some of that common view. That's what Wheeler said, and that's what we're going to see to close this out. But we're going to quote here here we have the Histories of Herodotus himself, and this is translated by G.C. Macaulay. And we're going to see here that Herodotus, he criticizes the idea that these three continents are all perfectly of the same size, and he criticizes this idea that there's maybe a perfect ocean going perfectly around it, because what I've read on this, some of these Greek geographers, their maps are focused as much on symmetry as on precision, and Herodotus, being a smart guy, he critiques this. And then the last portions I'm going to read after this first quote, we're going to see that he talks about how India is the easternmost portion, Arabia is the southernmost portions, and he even talks about how he believes in this idea of the ends or the edges of the earth. And he seemed to believe that Greece was the center where civilization really was, and the further out you went, the peoples became more barbarous, more savage-like, and even some of these more supernatural things associated with Greek mythology would be found on the, such as monsters, whatever, chimeras, that type of stuff. That's all going to be found out in the far reaches of the earth, where he viewed Greece as the center of civilizations, and that's what his histories seem to indicate. So this is book 4, paragraph 36 of Herodotus. And he says, and I laugh when I see that many before this have drawn maps of the earth, yet no one has set the matter forth in an intelligent way, seeing that they draw ocean flowing around the earth, which is circular, exactly as if drawn with a compass, and they make Asia equal in size to Europe. In a few words, I will declare the size of each division and to what nature regards outline. So that's basically, he's saying, in a nutshell, he's saying that this view of the world is simplistic. That's really the best way for him to say it. It doesn't mean that he doesn't advocate for a globe, but he's saying this is an overly simplified map of the world. But that also, this map is still important, though, because this was the predominant Greek view of that time. So I got one more quotation. I know this video has been a lot of reading, but we're going to go next to book 3, paragraphs 178. No, book 3, paragraphs 106 and 107. And so and he's going to talk about how India is the easternmost portion, and then he's going to talk about how Arabia is the southernmost portion, and then that should give the context. And he says, it seems that the extremities of the inhabited world allotted to nature by the fairest things, as it was of Hellas to have its seasons more fairly tempered than other lands. For first, India is the most distant of inhabited lands towards the east. As I have said, and this land is not only of animals, birds, as well as four-footed beasts, are much larger than in other places, except the horses were surpassed by those of Media, called Nessian. But there is also gold in abundance there. Some got by digging, some brought down by rivers, and some carried off. As I explained just now, that there are also trees which grow while produce wool, while surpassing in beauty and excellent that from sheep, and the Indians wear clothing obtained from those trees. So that's interesting. So he says India is the furthest inhabited lands to the east. And I think he did believe that there was ocean past that. And then he goes, then again, Arabia is the furthest of inhabited lands in the direction of the midday, and in it alone of all lands grows the frankincense and myrrh and cassia and cinnamon and gum mastic. All these except myrrh are got with difficulty by the Arabians. Frankincense they collect by burning the storax, which was brought thence to the Hellenes by the Phoenicians. By producing smoke, they take it, for these trees produce frankincense and are guarded by winged serpents, small in size and various colors, which watch in great numbers each tree. The same kinds of birds attempt to invade Egypt. So obviously there's a lot about Herodotus that we could dwell on. We could say, was some of his views of things wrong? Yeah, I would say, in regards to geography or history or other things. Yeah, but the point is that the point we've tried to make throughout this video is that, and even Faulkner conceded some of this in his writings, that the Babylonians, the Egyptians believed in this dome sky. We saw that. We've seen that the Hebrews, there's good reason to believe that. If you go with Paul H. Skeely's scholarship or Heiser's scholarship, as much as they don't agree with the concept itself, they would agree that the Hebrews believed that. And then if you compare that with what we did in part 1, where we took Luther's view, we took Augustine's view, we took Thomas Aquinas's view, we start to see, wow, there's a lot more people who believe this than what we have now. And so then the question is the progress of the last 500 years, has it really been progress forward or not? So that sets a lot of the stage for the history, and that's really where we need to go. And then now we're going to be in a position where we can move forward to the biblical arguments and the empirical arguments with more certainty. And I think that's going to be important for our purposes. So all this to sum up, we've seen that amongst the Greeks, amongst the Babylonians, amongst the Egyptians, amongst the Hebrews, yeah, there were a lot of people who believed in flat earth. And we've also shown that the way Faulkner writes stuff is confusing and, dare I say, misleading. And he even laid that charge to flat earthers regarding the Book of Enoch. And like I said in my first video, I said I want to give him the amount of grace he gives to flat earthers. And when you read his book, he really doesn't give much at all. So that's really where I'm coming from, kind of corresponding back in the same way that he seems to interact with us. That's kind of the same way I'm interacting with his material. I know some people aren't going to like this, but that's just the way things are. And we've really seen that there's a lot of good evidence that can be brought forward to say, yeah, ancient peoples believed in this. And then we can partner that with what we saw in part 1 with Augustine, Aquinas, Luther. And let me say here, John Calvin in his Institutes, he has the famous quote where he laughs at Plato he talks about how the Plato believes in the absurdity of his little globe. And I may even read that quotation in a different context. But yeah, Calvin even rejected, he knew that Plato believed that, and he just rejects it. So one more point I'll make here before we close out is that we can count heads all day. We can go back and forth all day, but at some point you just got to go to the Word of God and say, what does the Word say? And that's really where we probably need to go next. So I'm going to think about it. I don't want to make any dogmatic promises. We might do one more historical one, moving more into there's more medieval context that I can go through, or we may move forward to the biblical stuff. I need to think about what's best. But this is really, in a nutshell, this has been me interacting with Danny Faulkner's material, and we've really shown that there is good reason to believe specifically that the ancient Hebrews believed in a flat earth. So all that being said, I hope this has been helpful for you. And this has been Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. God bless everybody. If you have been blessed by the ministry of RTM, then please consider supporting our ministry and check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.